We're so glad you're here. I'm John Jordan, and on behalf of St. James Parish, it's our pleasure to welcome you. I chair the Speaker Series Committee for the parish, at least right now, and it's our pleasure tonight to welcome David Zahl. David was with us, I think, pre-COVID, some 3.2 years ago, something of that fashion. But I'm going to let his good friend Reed Murkison do the honors of introducing him via a more personal bio. In the meantime, I got word today that I'm excited to share with you that our next speaker will be on February the 8th of next year. We will welcome the Reverend Scott Black Johnston, who is senior pastor at Fifth Avenue Presbyterian in Manhattan. He's just completed a book over the past year called Elusive Grace, and I think it's going to be a wonderful follow-up to what you'll hear David address tonight, but particularly in the culture and political climate that we find ourselves these days, how we get along with people we love but still disagree. We, for the first time, will co-collaborate on this presentation with our friends at First Presbyterian. They were fortunate enough to welcome Scott Black Johnston some 12 years ago as a speaker and preacher there, and his accolades have stuck, and many people still talk about it. As a former Presbyterian, I can speak to Scott's background and his solidity and high level of respect that he carries from many of his colleagues in the wider church and beyond. So mark your calendars for that. That will be on Wednesday evening, February the 8th, 7 o'clock is the appointed time, and we will be the physical hosts for that here at St. James. So without any other words necessary, I'd like to welcome Reed Murkison to introduce David Zahl for you.
Thank you, John. It's a pleasure to see all of you, and it's a pleasure to have David back with us. Linda and I have known David since he was born. His parents are dear friends. His younger brother is our godson. David, after graduating from Georgetown University, worked for several years with an organization called Focus, Fellowship of Christians in Universities and Schools. A fellow Focus alum, Richard Gwaltney, is here with us tonight. Focus is essentially kind of a young life for independent schools, and David was in the highly churched area of New England. It was kind of an uphill battle, wasn't it, David? After that, he and colleagues founded Mockingbird Ministries. Mockingbird has since become a terrific resource for clergy and other Christians and seekers who are enlivened by the gospel of grace. And I can tell you, when the search committee was interviewing all of our various candidates to be called as rector here a couple of years ago, I remember one female priest who went on and on about the influence that Mockingbird had on her teaching and preaching. And tonight, we have at least one person from Newbern who has driven all the way here to hear David. Is anyone here from any further away than Newbern? Asheville, Luke. Luke had to come. David is Luke's boss.
Guess what? So Charleston's here.
What?
Charleston, South Carolina.
Charleston, South Carolina. So anyway, without further ado, please welcome David.
Thank you for having me. It's so good to be back here. It was a strange thing right before COVID to be out speaking. So I had all these, I had a book out right before COVID, and then right afterwards, and it feels like I was just here. At the same time, it could be ancient history. You know, I mean, I think life was still happening then. I don't know. It's like sort of there's a before and after. Anyway, I'm so happy to be with you tonight, and thank you for coming out on a Tuesday. It's really Yeah, it's fun to be in Wilmington. It's such a beautiful spot. So I'm here to talk to you tonight about Low Anthropology, this book with a strange title. And to tell you what I mean by that title, I'm going to sort of start like the way the book does, start a few steps back. And to do that, right as I was beginning to promote this book, there was a podcast that came out. It's by, I always forget the name of it. Maya Shankar. Do you guys know who that is? It's kind of the stories we tell ourselves. And it's a top-rated podcast. She's a cognitive scientist, and she interviewed a guy named Daniel Pink. Daniel Pink is like a leadership guru, a public intellectual, what have you. Interesting man. And he'd just written a book about regret. The book's called The Power of Regret. They were focused on the science of regret. And so she's talking to Daniel Pink, and he said, to write this book about regret, we did something special. We undertook the largest survey of personal regret ever undertaken. Right? Oh, sounds so exciting. The largest survey of personal regret. 22,000 people they polled about the subject of regret. Now, what they found when they polled these people is that 81% of people answered yes to the question, do you harbor real regrets about your life? And by the way, regret is classified as something that you had agency over, not something that happened to you, but a decision that you made that maybe you would have made differently. 81% of people answered yes. 17% of people answered no, and then went on to list all the things they regretted about their life. And I guess like 2% of people, if you're doing the math, they're just sort of psychopaths. But what happened was Daniel Pink had stumbled into an area of universal human experience. Universal human experience. Now we're told today, right, that no one can talk to each other, that we're so divided, there's nothing that unites us, and there's all sorts of ways in which those are narratives that feel incompatible, and they're reinforced. And yet here you had him stumbling into this area of regret. Now, I'll tell you a little bit about the World Regret Survey. It's interesting. I think he found that in your 20s, you regret actions and inactions in equal measure. And by the time you're in your 40s and 50s, it slants. Which way do you think it slants? Inaction. I've given a version of this talk now like 30 times, and no one has ever gotten that wrong. I mean, I don't know where we would be if it was completely mistaken. But yes, people regret inactions, because actions, theoretically, you can redress, you can reconcile, you can work to sort of make amends with people. But inactions, you get to to a certain age, and it just sits on your chest, right? And so I talked about foundational regrets, which are kind of, I wish I'd saved more money, or I wish I'd spent more time with my children. I wish I'd eaten differently, for example, on the way down to Wilmington. Then you have the most serious regrets, the smallest proportion, but the ones that stick around the longest are moral regrets. And the regrets, things like bullying. And he was very surprised by how many people had instances of childhood bullying that they either witnessed or perpetrated, that they were still regretting in their 70s and 80s. They could still recall like that, bullying. And I identified with this, by the way, because I was a bully to one person in my life, and it was not on the school ground. It was at the home. I was terribly mean to my younger brother. The two, Linda and Reed's godson. Cards on the table. This is well known at this point. I was not a nice older brother, especially during the teenage years. I would sort of, wrestle with him and, demean him and do all sorts of things to make him feel poorly about himself. And he turned this into his college essay. And he got into Harvard. So I have some regrets about that experience. But maybe he doesn't because it was his meal ticket, I guess. So thank you very much, Simeon. You're welcome. But that's not, I don't really need, you're not here to talk about regret tonight. We're here to talk about low anthropology, because what happens in this podcast is after laying out all this stuff about regret, Maya Shankar asks Daniel Pink, she says, you've spent 3 years marinating in the regrets of the human race. How are you doing? Are you okay? That sounds depressing. Because, he'd heard some really heart-wrenching things. And what he said is, you'd think that I would have had it with the human race. Or I would just simply be discouraged about the amount of folly that we are complicit in. And all of this heartbreak and tragedy, but instead, I feel more connected to my fellow humans and more compassion for them than I ever have in my entire life. I feel better than I did before writing this book, partly because I know I'm not alone. Interesting, right? Interesting. So, okay, keep that in mind. And now think about, there's an emblematic cartoon for this book, that if you understand this cartoon, you'll get some sense of where I'm going with this, with what I'm trying to do. It's a cartoon of a crowded city street. And everyone is going in different directions. There's young and old, and there's male and female, and there's people of all different ethnicities and backgrounds, and no one's talking to each other. But there are thought bubbles going up from each of their heads. They're all going up to the exact same thought. Now, what do you think they're all thinking?
Where am I going?
Where am I going?
I was there too.
They're all thinking this. All these people really seem to have it together, and I still have no idea what's going on. It's a wonderful cartoon. And to see it, you feel less alone than the people going in different directions. And what they're expressing here is that they feel that everyone else has it together, and they are the only ones hanging on by a thread, the only ones making it up as they go along. There's a term in the culture for this. Do you know what the term is?
Fake it till you make it.
Imposter syndrome. Fake it till you make it. That's sort of a result of imposter syndrome. Imposter syndrome. This is the syndrome that afflicts people. I work with students at the University of Virginia, and I hear time and time again from talented young people who think that they're the only ones who don't belong in their physics program or in their 5th year master's program. And if everyone else knew Dave, well, then they'd send me away. I hear that. You hear that over and over again until you finally realize that imposter syndrome is not really a syndrome. It's simply the universal truth of human nature. All of us feel like we are alone in our confusion, in our disorientation. So here you have 2 areas of universal experience. And universal, you were laughing a little bit at it. And I don't think these are conditions that make you disdain other people, but in fact you feel more known, more close. You have bridges that are formed to other people that are not virtuous bridges. We are united in our confusion, in our regret, and in all sorts of other kind of what you might call negative experiences. It's remarkable that you think that, but that sounds like I don't want to think about that, Dave. I don't want to think about how I'm imposter syndrome. I certainly don't want to think about my regrets. And yet, here we have the opposite proving to be true. We feel closer, less alone, more communion with our fellow humans through these experiences. Now, what does this have to do with low anthropology? Well, let's take this second word, anthropology. Maybe you hear that word and you think of a class in college that you didn't want to take. You think about cultural anthropology. You think about people studying the norms and practices of tribes in the rainforest. Now that's cultural anthropology. But theologians and philosophers use the word anthropology not as a highfalutin word. They're trying to actually use it as shorthand for whatever your operating view of human nature is. Whatever your operating view of human nature. Now everyone, I think, has an operating view. We all have something we mean when we say the words, I'm only human, right? Those words, by the way, escaped the mouth of one Tom Brady no less than 3 weeks ago. Do I have any football fans in here? I, for one, was like, I didn't think he was human. I didn't think that the guy was capable of a imperfection. Yet here, of course, it's terrible. It means the breakdown of his family, but he's saying, I'm only human to connote I'm not perfect. But all of us have something we mean when we say the phrase, I'm only human. Or maybe you think something like, well, people can always change. Or maybe you think something like, well, some people never change. Or maybe you think those people will never change. Or that person will never change. These are all anthropologies. These are taken together. We have a sense of of what we think humans are good at or not so good at. What are the principles that govern our behavior? So don't be put off by that $4 word. It simply means your theory of human nature. And whether we realize it or not, all of us have one, and it informs expectations in our relationships, in our jobs, in our marriages, in our politics, and especially in our spiritual and religious lives. Some anthropologies lead to disappointment and anger and bitterness and cynicism. Other anthropologies can be energizing and life-giving. What they can't be is non-existent. Now, the contention of this book is that seeing people as they truly are, as opposed to how we would have them be, is a crucial ingredient in generating lasting love and authentic compassion. An accurate anthropology opens us up to all sorts of unexpected vistas of hope, but not flimsy hope, but hopes that endures. Now what about the other part of this title? Because it said low anthropology. I'm not sure about that, Dave. You ever seen the Seinfeld episode where they get low flow shower heads installed in their building, and everyone keeps saying, low flow? I don't like the sound of that. Everyone wants a low flow shower head, and then they have to go and find the black market of shower heads, and they got like Serbian shower heads that are blast you through the wall. Anyway, that has nothing to do with this. Anthropologies, for the sake of this book, can be charted on a continuum of high to low, low to high. Think of it as a barometer of human potential. On the high end, you find sort of sunnier and optimistic estimations of human beings. You run into sort of grander visions of human enterprise. On the low end, you run into what I would call the more sober estimations of human enterprise. The understandings that you and I are in need of help. Someone asked me what low anthropology actually means, and I said it's an understanding of human nature that sees you and I as fundamentally, foundationally in need of help from other people and ultimately from God. What is ground zero for the proliferation of anthropologies? What do you think? Graduation speeches. Anytime you've gone to a graduation, you have heard an anthropology. You've heard some vision of the good life proclaimed and some sort of urging of how to get there, how to realize that good life. You've had a set of assumptions foisted upon you about what human beings are capable of and what they should be capable of and what they're incapable of. Now, I take in the beginning of this book, I look at two different ones. I first look at Steve Jobs in 2005 addressed Stanford, and he told those Stanford graduates, have the courage to follow your heart and intuition. They somehow know what you truly want to become. sounds inspiring, right? Especially if you're Steve Jobs. What a great thing to know that you were leaving Palo Alto with everything you needed to enslave the entire human race. Where's your phone right now? You can feel it on you, right? Yes. So that's Steve Jobs, and again, it sounds nice. Then you have someone like Anne Lamott. Any Anne Lamott readers in here? Presbyterian writer, AA, mystic, NPR personality from Marin County. And she gave us a different kind of graduation speech. And she told people, everyone is screwed up, broken, clingy, and scared, even the people who seem to have it more or less together. They are much more like you than you would believe, so try not to compare your insides to their outsides. All right, Anne. Now, high anthropology views people as defined by their best days, by their greatest achievements, their dreams, their aspirations. A low anthropology assumes a more reliable through line of heartache and self-doubt. It assumes that the bulk of our mental energy is spent more on what Anne is talking about than what Steve is talking about. On subjects that are petty and possibly even shameful, or they would be if they were broadcast nationally. But think if I have a 10-year-old, I've got a 12-year-old and a 6-year-old. My 10-year-old came home from school one day and said, hey, Dad, guess what I learned? I learned that everyone is screwed up, broken, clingy, and scared. I'd say, son, what? You just must have had a bad day. Let's go get some ice cream, watch some YouTube, or whatever it is they seem to be completely addicted to. But they, I'm kidding, blame Steve Jobs. There's a lot more Steve Jobs hate out in California. I gave this talk, and there was a woman in the congregation at a Lutheran church who came up to me and said, I graduated from Stanford in 2005. And the video you've seen of that talk, you see us all nodding our heads like sheep. And the fact is, it was 105 degrees out there, and we were completely preoccupied by the heat. Everyone was uncomfortable and hoping he'd finish up really soon. And so I thought that was so funny, because this talk about high anthropology was actually dominated by people focused on their appetites and their desires and their personal bodily comfort, which is a through line of low anthropology. That if you really want to get to know people, you need to figure out what their blood sugar level is first, right? Okay, so if I heard that, I'd tell my son, you're great, don't worry about that. I don't want you to say that. And, the graduates, maybe they were inspired, I don't know. But forget your child for a moment. What about you? What if you had a tough week? What if you spoke insensitively to a loved one? What if you lost your temper at someone scanning your groceries? Or you fumbled the ball at work or school or at church? Well, Lamott's description might all of a sudden strike you as more accurate. You might feel recognized by her words, and frankly a little burdened by Steve Jobs' exhortation. After all, you're no longer 22. You're 43, or you're 53, or you're 83, and you don't always love what you've become, or where your good intuition has led you. You are a person who responds to the World Regret Survey in the affirmative. Or perhaps you look at your siblings. You look and you think, where's my courage? Where's my good intuition, Simeon? I'm just kidding. I mean, just whoever it is. That's my younger brother's name is Simeon. Lamott's admission conveys compassion. You can feel your shoulders unknot. Steve Jobs' advice, not so much. His words convey pressure. And this is the great irony of a low anthropology. What sounds insulting is actually liberating, and what sounds liberating at first is actually oppressive and embittering. Now, I say all that to you because I wrote a book that is trying to expound on precisely that irony. And it's an irony that I think it's not just an irony, it's a truth. That is brought on, it was inspired by several emotional, you might call them conditions in our culture. Two of them, I'll give you two of them. One is the burnout. You heard this word burnout? It came into being through journalism about millennials in the workplace. 25-year-olds who felt burned out even though they'd only been in the workforce for 3 years. And the profiles all said that they were all working 3 jobs and they were constantly being monitored and they'd never been not performing in their entire lives. Thank you, Steve. That you guys really, there's some real Apple stockholders in here, but you feel burned out. And then, the pandemic hit, and what did we hear? We heard that healthcare workers were burned out. And then we heard that mothers of young children were burned out. And then we heard about the deaths of despair among men in their 40s and 50s, and we were told that they were burned out. And then we heard that middle schoolers were burned out. And then we were told that retirees were burned out. And then we basically realized that everyone was burned out. Now, a culture of burnout is a culture in which more is demanded of you than you can possibly ever fulfill. It's the employers demand it, and the employees believe it. But it is a cycle of despair because it is crushing, and it's based on a high anthropology. So burnout is one cultural condition that we take seriously because it leads to all sorts of other things. And it seemed to resonate all across the world. And by the way, you know who's also at the top of the list of burnout? Clergy. Do you know what they've had to do the last 3 years? I mean, tip your waiter, right? I mean, they've had to be television hosts and epidemiologists and therapists and basically field impossible demand from warring factions within their congregation. But that's a completely different story. I'll just say, be pledged this season. I know that you're in the middle of that. But that's one of the cultural conditions. I see you, Caleb, back there. The other cultural condition is loneliness. And loneliness, if you've kept track of the mental health data, it's just gone skyrocketing. And loneliness is almost always correlates to sort of an intolerance of weakness, because people only feel known and less lonely when they're actually seen for who they really are. You can be respected, you can be admired for your virtues, but no one feels known or loved if their weaknesses, their limitations, their shortcomings are left off the table. You just have to go to any wedding rehearsal dinner on the face of the planet, and you will hear bridesmaids toast the bride-to-be, and they will talk about, yes, how beautiful and lovely she is. But the ones that know her well will then start telling you about what she's like in her sweatpants on a Tuesday night when they've ordered takeout and they're watching Hallmark movies and they're let me tell you what she was like in the fall of '94 when the bottom fell out, And then the guys will get up there and give toasts and they just roast each other. And they basically say, yeah, he's all right, but I can't believe anyone's marrying him. Because let me tell you what happened that one night in 1993. But what you're conveying is that you love this person because you know them. And if you're living in a culture where you have to curate your identity all the time and your persona, then loneliness will ensue. There's other reasons around loneliness. But I think loneliness and burnout are the function of a high anthropology. So, a low anthropology, this book is my attempt to cut through this noise with hope. Understanding that what a low anthropology is actually the doorway to love and grace and unity, sympathy, curiosity, and ultimately faith. I think our cultural despair is fueled in large part by a superficial view of human nature, by anthropology. It's not that these things are totally false, but they're just not the complete picture. It's a view that flatters us with fantasies about our capacities and our motivations, but fails to account for the actual data of our lives, leaving us lonelier and more burned out as a result. I mean, I hear from so many people who feel burdened by the pressure to perform an ideal version of themselves. Now, for the Christians here, and I assume we're in a church, so I'm on solid ground. A low anthropology is simply a Christian anthropology. It's what you might call a Pauline anthropology, an Augustinian anthropology, a reformational anthropology, or simply a biblical anthropology. It is not a view that sees people as categorically bad or categorically good, but as a mixture of all sorts of competing motivations and tied in knots from difficult backgrounds and in need of help from one another and ultimately from God. Because that is really the ultimate hope in this book, is to marshal the resources of the Christian faith to make a emotionally intelligible case for belief in God as something that is both compelling and urgent in a time marked by division, burnout, loneliness, mercilessness, resentment, and fear. To bring to bear the grace of God in any recognizable or tangible fashion, one must begin with a low anthropology. Now, not surprisingly, I've found that a low anthropology yields to a high Christology. The smaller view of oneself, the larger God becomes. All of a sudden, you're approaching the world not for resenting it for what it's not, but in awe and wonder for all of the beauty that surrounds you, in spite of the fact that I'm like this and that person there is like that. It is a world in which Christ's words, that it is the sick that need a doctor, not the well, that it is not the righteous but sinners that I have come to call, make not just sense, but take on a life or death sort of appeal and urgency. Now, I'll close before. I'd love to do some Q&A. It's only 7:34. On the dot. Has anyone here read the book Just Mercy by Brian Stevenson? Okay, he's a wonderful man. He's a black lawyer who's Yale trained, and he wrote this book about his work as an advocate for men on death row. And these are men who, by and large, have been convicted of violent and heinous crimes. They tend to occupy the lowest rung on the social ladder, and they're seldom the recipients of sympathy or interest from the outside world. Now, in the introduction to that book, Brian talks about how it is that he can keep going, year after year, when the cards seem so stacked against him and his clients. There's echoes of Daniel Pink's question, how are you not depressed? Now, Brian, note what he doesn't say. He doesn't say, well, I believe everyone is created in the image of God and worthy of dignity, which might be 100% true. But is it enough to keep him going year after year in this sacrificial work? This is what he says. He says, I do what I do because I'm broken too. We're all broken by something. We have all hurt someone and have been hurt. We all share the condition of brokenness, even if our brokenness isn't equivalent. I desperately wanted mercy for a client, but I couldn't pretend that his struggle was disconnected from my own. Our shared frailties connected us. Our brokenness is also the source of our common humanity, the basis for our shared search for comfort, meaning, and healing. Our shared vulnerability and imperfection nurtures and sustains our capacity for compassion. Now, what a thing to say. But what a Christian answer to give when it comes to the counterintuitive motivation that motivates so many transformational communities. You think of like Alcoholics Anonymous, that begins each meeting with the confession that I am Dave and I'm an addict, which is not dissimilar from the confession of sin that Christians, at least in liturgical traditions, recite week after week after week after week. Now, it's not enough. It's not just a place to confess, because it's also a place to be absolved, to be met with the promise and hope of the resurrection. But that's my hope for Low Anthropology, as unambitious as that sounds. Thank you for listening. Thank you for listening. Anyone have any questions or comments they want to share? Anything it brings up? Yes.
I was intrigued tonight to listen to one of your fundraisers that's here tonight from Asheville. And he said, I said to him, what is the meaning and derivation of your Mockingbird ministry? Where did that derive from? And I thought it was really a wonderful answer that he said a mockingbird does not have his own voice. He doesn't sing his own song. He repeats what he hears around him. And I kept thinking, well, that's like spreading the gospel, isn't it? Spreading the good news. Maybe he's hearing a lot of good things out there in his world. And I thought that was a nice analogy.
Thank you.
For mockingbirds.
Anyone hear that in the back? Mockingbird Ministries, the organization that I direct, our name is derived from the fact that the mockingbird repeats what it's heard. And we believe we're called to repeat the message of God's grace for real people in all sorts of fresh ways, but over and over and over again. None of us ever graduate from our need for that word of pardon and hope. Any other thoughts?
David, I'd be curious to know if you're using any of your low anthropology outlook as you're rearing your children. And I mean, you spoke of a recent interaction with one of your kids when they came home from school, but how does this lay itself out in your outlook for how you and your wife raise your kids?
The parenting question. It's. I think that I want to be who my kids come to when their low anthropology rears its head. I don't want to be the one they run from because I'm totally intolerant of it. You might hear that and think, well, you then encouraging or licensing bad behavior. And I think that people overreact to bad behavior when they think their child is the great exception to the human race. They're uniquely sociopathic and they're biting kids in kindergarten, and what does this mean? We're going to hell or something like that. You know, you watch parents freak out about like little incidents and we think it's forever, and of course, it's just a little stage. So I think the low anthropology allows us to encourage good behavior, but not completely be depleted and exhausted by bad behavior when it comes, to not be surprised by it. So in terms of how it works out with my own children, I think it means I say sorry to them a lot. I apologize to them. I make sure they know that, not in a way that undergirds their basic security in life, but that they know that their parents are not perfect. I grew up, one of the other cultural conditions of this book was, and I realize this isn't everyone's experience, but I grew up in sort of coastal prep schools that hammered home to us how special we were. And we were special, I mean, right? I mean, look at what you're getting to witness tonight. You obviously were super special. But what that has produced en masse is a cohort of young people who get out into the real world and are mystified by their own behavior and the experience of life. And there was a wonderful article that I quote in the book called How to Land Your Kid in Therapy. And it was basically shield them from any negativity, ever. And so you will ensure that when they finally go out into the real world, they will not be able to function because any experience of their own low anthropology is going to completely undo them. And so I don't want that for my children. It also breeds something that today is just called entitlement, that I don't think is a very attractive quality either. So low anthropology, you could err on the other side. What sometimes people hear when they hear low anthropology, or they talk here, because I'm really translating the Christian doctrine of creatureliness and original sin. That's what this book is actually doing, for those of you keeping score. The last book was one translating justification by faith into contemporary language. This is translating those other core truths of the Christian faith. People hear shame. What they hear is you're bad, or they hear you are a worm. And there are Christian traditions in which people have grown up with that sort of basic no, that you have nothing worthwhile to contribute. Now that is a situation in which truly the dignity and imago Dei has been ignored to a tragic extent. And people can grow up deeply wounded by that. For me, it's kind of evidence of our low anthropology that we tend to weaponize it against other people, when in fact names an experience of lack. So, I don't ever want to communicate to my children that some sort of basic no. And in some cases, people who've grown up in that need to hear above all that about that they are created. They do have something worthy. God has given them gifts to contribute. They do have something worthy. In my own context, we were told that too much. And as Christians, we were baffled again by the ongoing sin in the life of a believer. We were told everything was always going to be getting better and better and better, and life was just an upward trajectory. And that's belied by life and our own low anthropology. So that's a really long answer to a short question. But I think it's important. There's some contextual parts of this, but there's also a way. By the way, what shame-inducing religious backgrounds do, they don't have a low enough anthropology, because what they're telling people is you were a worm, you were a miserable sinner, you were awful, now stop. Stop it. Stop it. Grip that thing even tighter. And that pits a person against themselves with resources they don't have, and it causes explosions. And a low anthropology says, you are you are finite, you are conflicted and doubled, you are, there is a dark side to human nature, what we call sin, and you are in need of help, but the help is not coming from you, the help comes from God. And so it puts hope where it actually is to be found, rather than turning a person against themselves internally in a battle they can never win. So, what else?
Hey, I'm Louise Coggins, and I'm a psychotherapist for 49 years, and everything you said is what I deal with all day long. I have instances today from the prep school example, everything you said, from the suicide of one of my patient roommates. It's just so sad what is going on now and what has happened, and all day long I deal with that regret. And one of my good friends, another therapist, gave me the power of regret, which I just read on vacation last week, and every day I deal with regrets, people in their 80s from something from childhood. And when I talk about forgiveness of other people, you will be set free if you can forgive your parents, your spouse, whatever. But the biggest thing I realized after years of talking about forgiving others is self-forgiveness is by far harder. And it's really the core, but low anthropology allows that. I've never known that much about anthropology, did not take it in college. So, I mean, the concept of it, but I love this Bible because my husband who's at another church again. But I thank you, and if you ever don't want to be an author and professor, you could be a comedian and a psychologist.
Thank you. God.
Join my practice.
That means so much to hear you say that. Yes.
I have become a person who cries all the time, so I'll probably cry. But what you just said about being a person that my kids run to, graduating from when they're looking at their college careers, it said, I needed to hear that on a week where I'm solo parenting and not off to a great start. So, thank you. I am on campus staff with RUF here at UNCW, and I listen to your podcast. Your podcast is the only podcast I listen to with any frequency, and I just want you to know as you're caring for, leading college students at UVA, you are reaching so many more college students across the world.
Thank you.
And the way your banter is hilarious, so insightful. The grace that you speak of, I mean, when I'm leading Bible study, when I'm meeting one-on-one with students, it is a rare time that I'm not referencing something that y'all have talked about. So, thank you.
Oh, gosh.
And
You're going to make me cry now.
please tell your mom thank you, because y'all posted the talk she gave in 2011, Grace for Families. I listened to that, and the very next day spoke at another church in town. They have a mom's group for moms with little ones, and there were so many questions about how do we think through schooling, how do we think through our kids' friends, so many things, and I had David Zahl notes. So, 11 years later, that talk is bearing fruit. And I've had so many friends that I've sent that to, or who have referenced it, and so I'm just so grateful and was so excited to see that you were coming. So
Oh my
thank
goodness.
you for all that you do. And your recent fundraising letter was excellent. My husband and I both cried in the first paragraph.
I did not put her up to that. Mr. Watley.
What do you say to people who hear your presentation or read your book and say, no, that's not me. That might be you, loser. That's not me. Because there are plenty of those.
There are plenty of people. Well, I think to a certain extent, there's just, you can't argue someone into this. Like that's one of the tenets of low anthropology is that we're emotional creatures rather than intellectual creatures. And so you sort of, when it comes to these sorts of great shifts, paradigm shifting things, it has to be accompanied by some form of experience where their agency is limited, and I do think that everyone will experience that in death. So there's something leveling about my hope there. What I'm trying to do in the book is to present alternate language that provides other ways in. Like there's a glut of books that have appeared in the last few years about vulnerability. Maybe you know the work of Brene Brown. I happen to really like Brene Brown, but she's absurdly popular. Millions and millions and millions of people reading and talking about her books. And what to me that she talks about vulnerability, and she's mostly speaking to women, but she talks about the burden of perfectionism that people feel. And that is a very real burden, and the fact that books about vulnerability are that popular shows to me that there's a tremendous appetite to tell the truth about yourself, or to gravitate towards someone who is not asking you to be a perfect human being. Whether someone can make the leap from, okay, well, I'm not perfect, I need to be vulnerable, to I'm actually a sinner in need of redemption, that can be a long journey. But I don't think you can actually argue someone into... to me, much of the truths of low anthropology are borne out in studies of literature and history and current events. I mean, like, it's corroborated every minute of every day. So I don't think you can outrun it, ultimately, without becoming completely alone. Because a high anthropology isolates. It's always an us versus them thing. If just those losers would get out of the way, then the rest of us winners could engineer utopia. And that is just, that's simply a dehumanizing categorization of people. I don't know. You send them to a focus program. Yes?
Hey, so I'm Philip Craig, I'm the director here at St. James. So glad you're here. I'm thinking about an hour or so that we have with folks on Sunday morning when they come to worship, and the spectrum of low versus high anthropology over the course of our common worship. And definitely thinking in my mind of that favorite prayer, we're not worthy so much as to gather the crumbs under thy table, but thou art the same Lord whose property is always have mercy. How do you think the church is doing around, outside of the beauty of our liturgy, meeting people where they are and connecting with this idea of low anthropology? How's the church doing?
I mean, the church is no more immune to high anthropology than anyone. The amount of stories you hear of high anthropology, religion, that sort of projects a form of Christian perfectionism, whether that be in a sort of an individualistic piety or a social justice sort of service. Like, both of these forms kind of see the principal project of the Christian faith as sort of improving either the world or yourself to a point where you no longer really need God that much. So I think one of the reasons I go to a liturgical church, one of the reasons I love the prayer book is you're gonna hear it, even if the preacher's terrible, even if the electricity goes out, you're going to hear the same message. You're going to hear the Collect for Purity that says, God from whom no secrets are hid, all desires known. And you're saying, oh my gosh, really, everything? And then in light of that, then you confess your sins, you say the prayer of humble access, and then you come and kneel together, the ultimate democratization, and with the hands outstretched, and you're fed, and I think then sent forth. And like, what's the great commendation is to go out to do the works that God has prepared in advance for you to walk in. I mean, that doesn't sound like a to-do list. It sounds like a surprise party. And that's a completely different way of looking at the world. So I don't think the church, it does very well. But when the church tries to sort of compete with the world and make it into a product that's going to turn you into a more Christ-like person overnight, I don't think that ultimately works. But if it's a place to come when you've fallen short with your shame, with your failures, with your imposter syndrome, with your regrets, and to lay them at the foot of the cross, then I think that message will never go out of style. That will never get old for you.